Welcome to Foresight TV. This is a special edition. Normally we broadcast on Fridays, but in order to meet everybody's schedules, we are doing the special edition. I want to say welcome to Bob Kramer, who is widely known, and Anne Tumlinson, who is probably not as widely known as Bob. But first, let's start with our introduction, and then I'll turn the stage over to you. Hey guys, Steve Moran here. And with Bob, I'm going to step off the stage and turn it over to you for the next 30 minutes.
All right. Well, thanks, Steve. Appreciate it. Thanks for this opportunity. I'm Bob Kramer. I co-founded NIC many years ago, served for a long time as its CEO, now serve as a strategic advisor. I also am founder and fellow with Nexus Insights. And today I have as a guest with me, Anne Tumlinson. Anne is also one of the fellows at Nexus Insights. Despite what Steve may have said in his intro, in the policy world, Anne is much better known than I am and has a long and very distinguished career there. And it's a wonderful thing for us in senior care and in long-term care that Anne is so focused in this area. And I'm delighted, Anne, that you could join us today. Anne is the founder and CEO of ATI Advisory, based in Washington, D.C., and she also founded Daughterhood.org. So welcome, Anne.
Thank you. Great to be here. Thanks, Bob.
We're going to talk today about our long-term care system or lack thereof. There are a lot of proposals that have been put forth recently, some obviously in response to COVID and the challenges of COVID and the great impact it's had on congregate settings for older adults. And others, one might say, more a response to long-standing issues that just haven't been addressed and quite frankly have been ignored. So I guess my first question to you, Anne, is briefly, can you describe the system, or do we even have a system for funding long-term care today? And in particular, I'd ask you to also have on your hat as someone who started Daughterhood.org, and you can explain for a moment what that is. Do all the folks involved with you at Daughterhood, do they experience a system when they're in crisis and they're looking for help?
Yeah, no, thank you. Thanks, Bob. That's a great question. And so Daughterhood is a community, for those of you who don't know, it's a community of caregivers all around the country that meet regularly in a variety of, whether it's over Zoom or in person, over coffee, over wine, to swap insights and information about the experience of caring for older adults who are family members or friends or neighbors. So we have about 25 or 30 local Daughterhood circles all around the country, and they meet regularly. So if you're looking for one, go to our website and check it out. But for me personally, the experience of being the founder of that group and interacting with our leaders in that community is that I get to hear what it's like on the ground level. And then, of course, I have my own personal experiences with it as well. And I think when I pair that with my professional experiences, I come to the conclusion that we don't have a system. What we have actually is every individual family essentially creating from scratch every single time over and over and over again their own system. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of like, if you were trying to renovate your house and you decided to play general contractor yourself, it's probably much harder than that. But, conceptually that's what it's like. You are essentially, going out into the marketplace and asking yourself, what do I even need? What is out there that could help me? How do I get it? How do I set it up? How do I manage it? How do I coordinate it? Mm-hmm. All of those things there's no system or function in our society to handle that. So it's done by the family member. So there's no, and then as far as funding goes, there's nobody to pay for it either, any of these services that you might need, except Medicaid. And so, there are a number of, only, 2/3 of the people or 1/3 of the people who really need care are getting it paid for by Medicaid. So it plays a big role in that it's the only payer, but it plays a small role relative to private funds and family caregiving and unpaid contributions and things like that.
Well, I guess the question then, the follow-up question would be, if we don't really have a system, if each family is kind of creating its own network, and figuring out what services do I need, how do I judge quality, who pays for what, and I know from experience that the adult child is then at the center of making sure everyone's communicating to each other. Otherwise, it isn't going to happen. But there suddenly seems to be a lot of interest in increased funding for specifically for home and community-based services, and there seems to be more focus. President Biden in his campaign had a plank in this area. There's now been a proposal for $400 billion over 8 years as part of the infrastructure bill. And in addition to that, in the recent version, the most recent version passed under the new administration of the CARES Act, there was specific increase the FMAP or Medicaid funding from the feds, but it could only be used for home community-based services. So why the sudden interest? And what's going on here? And give us just a sort of quick understanding of what's this movement now.
Yeah. So, I think it was exactly what you said earlier, Bob, that there's, that COVID has elevated the visibility of the long-term care experience in the country as it pertains to institutional settings, and I think elevated and raised for everyone the very real situation that we find ourselves in, which is that we don't have a system in the community, and we have a lot of people being served in facility settings. And now we don't really have that many people being served in facility settings relative to everyone in the community, but that's been the focus. And so it's just elevated this issue. But I will tell you, there's another thing kind of at work here, which has to do with jobs. And, I think the president's view that, one of the opportunities here is to create, better jobs in the caregiving sector. We need caregivers. We need direct care workforce. We don't have a good, way of paying for or employing or compensating a direct care workforce. And we have people who need jobs. So I think there's also a real interest in this. And I think a big part of the reason you saw $400 billion get proposed in the jobs and infrastructure part of this recovery plan, and not the families part of the recovery plan, really signals that this administration is seeing this as a jobs and infrastructure issue even more than they're seeing it as a family issue.
Well, maybe comment for a moment, because I know there's been some criticism of that, of saying, we're not saying it's not needed, but come on, this isn't infrastructure. You're trying to sell this as infrastructure. It's not infrastructure. So you've touched on that, but maybe dwell on that a little bit more in terms of, normally when you think of infrastructure, obviously jobs are a key part of that, but it's also jobs to fit where are we going to have needs in the future. So for instance, when we built the interstate highway system, the sense was, gosh, yes, we needed jobs, but we needed a highway system, because that was key if we were going to open up so much of the country in terms of commerce. So comment on this concern that, gee, how is this infrastructure? I don't get that. Why isn't this part of a healthcare bill or whatever? Yeah,
well, because fundamentally, really, truly at the core of the challenges that we faced in long-term care is a lack of infrastructure. That's, why, the only infrastructure actually that we do have in this country with respect to long-term care is our nursing homes and assisted living facilities. When you walk into a nursing home, what happens? You get your needs assessed, you get a care plan, There are people there to, arrange the services that you need. You have long-term care pharmacy. There's a number of things that are in place to help meet the needs of the people within that system. Yeah. In the community where we have no system, we have no infrastructure. If anybody listening to this has ever had that experience of sort of like, oh my gosh, what do we do now? This is the infrastructure piece, right? There's no place to go. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't have to be a physical place, although I think there's definitely a real opportunity there and a need for a physical place. But more than that, there's no sort of, entry point into a system. The entry point is the infrastructure. The pieces that connect the different parts of the system are infrastructure, and they can be virtual, and they can be real estate, and they can be technology-based, but they are the very definition of infrastructure.
Well, perhaps if I could let me try and sum up a little bit on that, and correct me if I've got it wrong. And that would be, in terms of infrastructure, we have a skilled nursing infrastructure that was, I know from the NIC research, the average building, the median age is more than 40 years of age for the nursing homes out there. So that's pretty old. And 72%, I think, are more than 30 years of age. And they were also built with a different resident and model in mind, sort of the old board and care home or rest home. And now we're increasingly seeing much frailer residents that have far greater needs in terms of support and services, much higher frailty level. So we have a system there for long-term care, but only once you qualify for Medicaid.
Right.
Other than that, you're on your own. And, if you have money, the assisted living's come along, and that option's been offered. Most of assisted living's private pay, maybe 12% Medicaid. But then if you live in the community, there has been a movement in recent years to so-called rebalance and to move away from an institutional focus, institutional bias, meaning that you only get long-term care paid for when you're poor if you're in a nursing home.
Right.
So talk to us a little bit about, we've been talking about lack of infrastructure in the community. We've got this infrastructure in skilled nursing. It's old, it's outdated for long-term care. We don't have anything in the community, but we have been rebalancing. In fact, I think the majority of long-term care funding overall coming from CMS is now headed to HCBS rather than headed to nursing home settings, although it's still a very small amount.
Yeah.
So talk to us about what is rebalancing, what's been the effect of it, and does this mean that the administration and that we are going to move totally away from an institutional setting? Will this replace institutional setting? But first of all, what do we mean by rebalancing and this idea of institutional bias in Medicaid?
Yeah. So I love this question. So first of all, almost all the time when people talk about balance, they are talking about the distribution of dollars in Medicaid. And so just to address that point first, we do spend now, of all of the Medicaid spending on long-term care, we do spend slightly more on home and community-based services than long-term care. But what's included in that are services for people with mental retardation and developmental disabilities who on average use a much sort of higher per person spend than other categories. When we look just at older adults and people with physical disabilities, the spending on institutions is actually quite a bit higher than home and community-based services. So we still have an imbalance in the allocation of dollars. If you want to argue that balance is 50-50, we're not there. And if you want to argue that balance is really, it should be the majority of dollars in the community and the minority of dollars in the nursing home setting, we're definitely not there. We're very far from there. I think we could argue about what actually should be the right balance. But nonetheless, we have a long way to go to even get to 50-50. But the reason why, so the question becomes, then why is that so hard? We've been working on it for a long time. It's gotten a lot of attention. And we've made a lot of progress, but why are we still where we are? And it really does have to do with what I call a whole bunch of sort of like nooks and crannies in the Medicaid statute and regulations that make it very, very hard for a state to actually move dollars into that side. The reason why that we've had some very good advocacy that's happened in the community that's seen more dollars go to home care, but in the other communities, not so much. So essentially, it boils down to the fact that, nursing home setting is a mandatory service in Medicaid. So as a state, you cannot participate and draw down federal dollars in Medicaid if you do not offer nursing home services according to the guidelines set out by the federal government. Home and community-based services is not only it's a state option, it's a waiver, it's optional. So that in and of itself is a huge sort of bias towards institutional care. But then there's all of these other things like provider taxes. So home and community-based providers do not participate in the provider tax program. They're not allowed. The provider taxes are an enormous source of revenue for states. As long as they have a robust nursing home program, they can levy provider taxes on nursing homes. It essentially means that we have an effective matching rate for institutional services that far exceeds what we have for home and community-based services. So starting to avoid the matching rate proposal in the recent rescue plan and probably what the Biden proposal will look like is to create that equity around matching rates and revenue for the state. The other thing, there are two other things that are huge. Well, one is huge and one is less huge, but the other one is room and board. So when you spend down to Medicaid in a nursing home, the amount of money that you pay on room and board counts towards the spend down. If you're in the community, you have to pay your rent, you have to pay for food, you have to pay for all of those other things, and then you start spending down on services, and the services are less expensive. So it's really, really hard to qualify financially for Medicaid solely on the basis of needing long-term care in the community. And then the third thing is pharmacy. If you're in a nursing home, what's included in that benefit is long-term care pharmacy. When you're in the community, you're on your own with CVS. And so again, it's kind of all on the family caregiver to figure it out. So there are more, but those are the kind of the key components of the institutional bias that I think we'll start to see, the administration and Congress begin to address. But let me be really clear, just because we want to create a greater degree of balance doesn't mean we don't need nursing homes. And I think it is incumbent on the policy community to work very, very hard on the infrastructure, to your point, Bob, for nursing homes as much as it is in the home and community. We need a better home and community-based services. We need a system, we need infrastructure, we need to fix all of these problems I've been talking about. But then we absolutely have to have a really strong sort of facility-based and institutional setting as part of the continuum. Otherwise, we're going to have people whose needs we're just simply not going to be able to meet in the community, and it won't be cost effective in some situations.
Well, let's drill down a little bit more on the extension of home and community-based services in the community. You recently, ATI, your advisory firm, put out a report, I think, with funding and participation with Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And you put out a number of facts there, and you also put out some specific proposals with regard to HCBS. Because one of the challenges, as you've just described, would seem to be with the current requirements. We basically are forcing people both into poverty and probably also into poor health choices prior to their qualifying, even if there are HCBS programs in their community prior to their qualifying.
Right.
So, what was in this report, and what were some of your key recommendations, and why you feel these recommendations will create a more, because certainly from my point of view, I've always, as you know, said it's a both and. We've got to adequately fund both and realize what's the appropriate setting in each case. Unfortunately, though, and I guess I'm in my usual way of asking a broad question and multiple questions, one of my concerns is if policymakers think, well, we're going to put more Medicaid dollars into home and community-based services, but we have requirements to access those services that are going to mean that by the time people access them, their health has been severely compromised. They're actually more likely to be more efficiently then cared for in the skilled nursing setting. What we really need to do is reach them to enable them to manage their chronic conditions better, longer, and safely at home. And that seems to be a huge void right now. So talk to us about your report, because I know you had some recommendations to address these various.
No, I mean, Bob, I totally agree with you. I wish, if I could be king for a day or queen for a day, this is a little bit like, we have such a huge gap here, even among the population that has a severe need for long-term services supports today. So just to back up and talk for just a quick moment, I'll talk through our recommendations, but we often talk about people who have a nursing home level of need. And these home and community-based services programs that we're largely talking about here are available only to people who have that nursing home level of need, but happen to live in the community. There may be gradations, nursing home operators will probably argue with me that they're not really as fine, but having a need for 2 or more activity of daily living limitation supports is very different than having a need for 2 IADLs, right? So just to get into the technical terminology here, but so we absolutely 100%, like, to me, the cutting edge is we need to be identifying functional cognitive decline, health conditions way before we get to the point where we have a nursing home level of need, and really trying to intervene along the way to help delay that functional decline. There is nobody who's doing that, really, except for maybe a handful of long-term care insurance companies are just beginning to think about it. Medicaid programs should be thinking about it, but they're not, because they're in these the problem is we're all in these short budget windows. And what you're talking about, Bob, is a longitudinal view, right? It's a population over a long period of time and managing it. And nothing is really set up, to reward anybody financially for doing that. So we're in these annual cycles, and we're focused on the population that's costing money right now. So as far as that population goes, where we're still not really doing a good job, what we've done at ATI was we went out and surveyed a whole bunch of organizations. We said, if we have $400 billion to spend, essentially, how do we need to craft the policy so we can really effectively serve people and increase sort of the numbers and people getting high quality, meaningful services in the community? And I think, one of the number one things that came up is that we have to, this is a state program. States run Medicaid, states pay for half of Medicaid. We are never going to get anywhere if we don't make it easy and financially viable for states. They are terrified of it doing. One of the biggest challenges of this expansion, an expansion like this, is the question that they ask themselves in 10 years, are we going to just be flooded with people who want to access
effect? Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So they worry about the Woodwork effect. They obviously worry about the revenue sources and provider taxes. And so what we have said is that we're never going to get anywhere as a matter of federal investment if we do not we've got to effectively, greatly enhance what states are able to get for the dollar that they spend. They still have to spend the same amount of money, but they need to be able to get like twice as much from us in the federal government. So a 10 percentage point increase in FMAP is a good start, which is what we had in the recovery plan. So we recommend, that at a minimum. I think states need to have some skin in the game. As long as this remains a state program, they need to have some skin in the game so that they can help. They'll be incentivized to manage it. But the financial piece for the states is a really big piece of it. The second piece is we've got to address this inherent disconnect in room and board. So we have to make it easier for people who live in the community, essentially to have money set aside to pay for room and board. The personal needs allowance that is currently in place in the community is not sufficient. It's just, we have essentially put up this huge wall between people in the community and those services, eligibility for those services. And then finally, we have to address the direct care workforce. Like we can put all the money in the world into increasing the amount of services, increasing the number of people who get services, increasing the amount of money states get. But if we don't address the compensation of direct care workforce, we won't have the infrastructure or anybody to actually provide the care.
Yeah.
So, and we are big fans of the, increasing the minimum wage to $15 an hour, creating a living wage for direct care workers, and making sure that providers are paid enough that they can still make margin on that.
Yeah. I read recently someone I know you follow and who follows you, Howard Gleckman, and Howard did a piece looking at that 400 billion, and one of the things he pointed out is, there are laudable but competing objectives here that could very quickly eat up that 400 billion. One, just simply, a $15 an hour, or however you define an increase for the current workforce. Two, getting people off the long wait lists in states for home and community-based services, those that have such programs. Now, those aren't all older adults, as you said. That includes many folks under 65 who are disabled, but trying to clear that huge backlog of work. And then a third thing, which is training to really make this not only in terms of salary, but in terms of training, truly an infrastructure program. And just those areas alone, without expanding this at all to anybody who, for instance, is at a higher income level, like that lower part of that, what we've written about, the forgotten middle at NIC.
Right.
So, but still, it's a step in the right direction. My concern is that people see it as either or, meaning that this is we won't need to put money any longer into nursing homes. And, we're going to need we have an outdated, crumbling infrastructure in nursing homes. We have a non-existent infrastructure in home and community-based services.
Right.
And we have a tidal wave of older adults living longer, many of whom will need services and supports. And lastly, we have, as AARP has put out numerous times, we have in the traditional unpaid caregiver workforce, 45 to 64, we have this dramatic drop in the ratio of folks in that age group to those over 80, which means the pressure for paid care at home or wherever setting is just going to go through the roof. And when that pressure goes up, costs are going to go up.
And we have no financing for it. So we have no financing.
Yeah.
There's no insurance system in the United States.
Yeah.
So,
and so I guess my point would be, you've mentioned several sort of the room and board allowance is one key area, raising the wages to actually make it a living wage, however one that defines that. And as two key areas, and the third one now is escaping me. There was the third key recommendation.
It's the state financial.
Yeah, and making it attractive to the state, so they're not sort of saying you're asking us to. They need to get more for the dollars they're putting in, as you put it. Let's, in the few minutes we have left, let's talk about, okay, if I'm in the traditional senior living industry, skilled operator, assisted living operator, I've got a group of not-for-profit life plan communities, and I'm trying to think through what my future strategy should be. Or if I'm a home care provider. So I just talked to somebody yesterday, and they've started a new home care company, and they're incredibly principled. They want to give good service, but they see this as a huge market opportunity. They think this is a boom field, and in many ways it is. But how should these folks think about this move to home and community-based services, and what does it mean for their strategy? And maybe you could address, in a minute each, if I'm a home care provider, if I'm a private pay senior living, not skilled nursing provider, and if I'm a skilled provider, just give me a few thoughts.
Sure.
How do I think about this and the impact? Is this competition? Is this great new opportunity? Do I need to change how I think about long-term care?
Right. Yeah. So I'll start with the home care provider. I think what we've been telling home care providers is it's not that you have to just make a strategic decision about what sort of pool of revenue you want to play in. And what we've seen is traditionally home care providers have been like, nope, private pay only, or yes, private pay and Medicaid, or mostly Medicaid. But the world's going to be a lot blurrier than that going forward. I mean, the great hope is this $400 billion or whatever it ends up being, and this larger kind of push to shore up our long-term care, infrastructure will ultimately create opportunities for home care operators to participate in multiple revenue sources and to remain sort of open-minded to that strategy and not just to write them off. So it's really a strategic question of like, how do you just begin to develop that muscle, whether it's Medicaid or even Medicare Advantage? So that's the home care space. I would say senior living is a tougher, I think it's almost more of a marketing, positioning, and advocacy strategic question for them right now, which is to say, if there's more money flowing into home and community-based services, making sure that these public programs remember that you are a community-based setting for the purposes of these dollars. You always have been, and you should continue to be. And how, what role can you play strategically and in your own organization and position your own organization, but also the industry to be, kind of part of the reform that we hope will happen going forward. And then, on the nursing home side, this is what I would never say is, oh, go get into the home care business if you aren't already in it. Don't do that. But I do think that, that there's going to be, there will be an ongoing need for nursing homes. It's going to be a matter of I've been saying this for 10 years, really, differentiating yourself in your market. What is it that, do you want to stay in this business? I mean, that's a strategic question I think you have to ask yourself. It's going to be hard, and, we're going to continue to fight these battles for a while. So, if you think you can deliver a superior product and differentiate in your market and serve a need, you've got a reason to stay. But if not, you have to be asking yourself that question.
Well, and with that, and we don't have time, but that would lead us into an area of discussion, for instance, of those holding that dollar risk for that dual individual or for that Medicare Advantage individual. And how are you going to make yourself attractive to them? Because they are likely to be your future customer. And
absolutely,
if you're blind to that, and you're not preparing for what they're going to be looking for and what they're going to be making an assessment on, you're probably going to become irrelevant sooner than later.
Yeah, it's not going to be a fee-for-service world.
And we also didn't get a chance to talk about PACE programs and PACE-like programs and the expansion of those to serve that forgotten middle, which is another area. But maybe Steve will have us back at some time, because that's another important topic. Because this is strictly home and community-based services. I'll close with this, Steve, is strictly expanding the options for the Medicaid eligible population. And many people don't realize that. Many seniors out there say, oh, this is wonderful, these options I'm going to have. Well, as Anne has explained, you only have those options once you spent down to meet the criteria. So, but anyway, there are some other options out there we need to talk about for serving that forgotten middle. So, Anne, thank you. Thanks for your time. Thanks for all you're doing in ATI and for joining me today. Appreciate it. And back to you, Steve.
I would say there's absolutely room for a part 2 here. The thing that you only touched on early on is that the truth is that even if you have financial resources, being a consumer of care it sucks. I've been through it with my mom. I thought that as an expert, I would slide through it. And it was a terrible, terrible experience with some bad missteps and fights with nursing home DONs. And it was just very, very unpleasant. I wish we could go on for another hour. I kept wanting to butt in and ask questions. But the one thing that I found myself wondering as we were talking about wages and minimum wages, and there's some in comments. I don't know whether you were clicked on the comments and actually saw them about creating real jobs. I find myself wondering if senior living ought to become a modern version of a WPA or a welfare to work, because there's so many dollars where you look at it and you say, well, we shouldn't supplement that, but really we end up supplementing a lot of low-income workers in really perverse ways through public programs. I mean, you know, Walmart can afford to pay their employees what they pay them in many, particularly in high cost of living states, only because of the public services that they consume. And somehow it seems like it would be better if they were working and earning that money and had better choices on those kinds of things. And so, you know, the question then is, you know, come back to private pay senior living, is how do you make that work? Because the idea of supplementing employees there sort of feels wrong, but maybe it's actually right. So anyway, great conversation. I wish we had more time to do this.
You've raised some great questions there, Steve, and I'll give you a 10-second reply, which
Awesome.
is the bond created by residents and staff through COVID is a window into that future where residents are invested in the staff. And because they realize the staff are literally, in this case, putting their lives on the line for them. And that's created a sort of sense of how do we support our staff as people, as families. And I think there are ways to build on that with regard to thinking very, very different, because obviously it's going to reflect in prices too. So, but a great topic to discussion. So I've got in my notes 3 great topips, each of which, but again, thanks for the time, and thank you, Anne, for all your contributions.
Thank you very much, and I'm already looking forward to a part 2 on this conversation. So,
all right.
Thank you to the audience. Have a great rest of your week. Thank you for watching, and thank you for your comments. Have a great day.
Bye.